Hello, I'm Marlo Souza from Federal University of Bahia in Brazil, and I'm going to present the work Belief Contraction in Nonclassical Logic as Hyperintensional Belief Change, and this is a joint work with Renata Wassermann from University of São Paulo. In this work, we investigate how we can integrate hyperintensional characteristics of our belief representations in the framework of AGM-like belief change, and how we can use these ideas to define belief change operators for some non-classical logics. So a brief summary of the presentation, I'm going to discuss briefly the notion of hyperintentionality and how we model this in this work, so we can deal with hyperintentionality in the AGM paradigm. And then I'm going to present one example of the hyperintensional contractions that we define in our work, how we characterize it by means of postulates, and how we apply this to define a contraction operation in a non-classical logic. And then I'm going to present some final discussion on our results. So basically, beliefs are understood as hyperintensional mental attitudes, meaning that what we can draw, which conclusions we can draw from our beliefs depends more on something more than just our sentential intentions, meaning the information that we explicitly believe. And the nature of the something else, which we call the hyperintensional context, really depends on the theory of hyperintentionality you're dealing with. So for example, if we take two sentences like 2 + 2 = 4 in piano arithmetics, and the continuum hypothesis is independent from Zermelo-Fraenkel axiomatics, both sentences are logical necessities, and as such, they are intentionally equivalent. But it's not reasonable to expect that someone that believes that 2 + 2 = 4 would also necessarily believe that CH is independent from ZF. So how we can incorporate this phenomenon about beliefs within the belief change theory, AGM, inspired by the AGM paradigm. In fact, there is some work treating this kind of things, this kind of phenomena. For example, Hanson's belief-based change can be understood as an attempt to do so, but there's no unified framework to reason about hyperintentional belief change, or how hyperintentionality influences the belief change process. So this is what we are interested in this work and in some early work. To talk about hyperintentionality in the AGM paradigm, we have to encode it using the same language, the same tools that we use to define AGM-like belief change operators. So we are using abstract logic machinery. So a logic is basically a set of formulas and a consequence operator. We do not require that consequence operators are Taskian. Actually, in general, what we will require for a logic is that it's monotonic and compact. And we will model hyperintensional mental attitudes or hyperintentional reasoning basically as a consequence operator that is related to the logic L, or basically to the consequence operator that we use to define the semantics of the language in some way. And there's two ways that we can analyze this. We have the hyperintensional consequence can be sound and can be complete. And while complete hyperintensional consequences are very interesting to model phenomena such as pragmatic implicatures and stuff like that, we will not really focus on that kind of operation. We'll focus more on sound hyperintensional consequences to define our belief change operators. And from belief change, we'll focus more on the framework of partial mid contractions, because they are characterized for a wider class of logics than AGM contractions. And a partial mid contraction basically is a contraction operator that can be defined as a intersection of some subsets of K that do not prove a certain formula that we want to remove from the belief set, from the belief base. And Hanson and Wassermann have characterized this kind of operations for any monotonic and compact logic as those satisfying the 4 postulates for belief-based change, which are inclusion, or success, inclusion, relevance, and uniformity. So we know that there are partial mid-contractions for a wide class of logics, and what we do is use this kind of operations as a baseline to contract or to perform contraction operators that take into consideration hyperintentional reasoning. So what we do really is we question different ways on how we can integrate hyperintentional reasoning in the process of contracting information. And to do this, we kind of speculate on investigate different notions of minimal change, which arise between on the relationship between the consequences C and Cn. And these different notions of minimal change give rise to different notions of belief contraction. And they can be applied to some non-classical logics if we understand these non-classical logics as defining hyperintensional differences in some foundational logic. And what we see in defining these different kinds of operations is that there is some form of interplay between the postulates of success, uniformity, and relevance. And when we change one to strengthen or weaken one, there's a impact on the other, strengthening or weakening the others. So, for example, we define the notion of C-sensitive contraction, which is based on the idea is based on the work of Francesco Berto's top sensitive belief revision. And basically, a C-sensitive contraction is a contraction in which first you perform contraction on the foundational logic, and then you perform hyperintentional reasoning to achieve your consequences, from this corpus of information that you maintained from your original belief state. And to characterize this operation, we basically take the postulates from partial mid-contraction and we change them accordingly to represent what is maintained and what is discarded in the process of contraction. And since the result of the contraction in this case is closed under a consequence operator, we have to include one postulate that is enforced enclosure relevant relative to the C consequence operator. And what we see is that depending on the properties of the hyperintensional consequence operator C, we can fully characterize our defined contraction by means of the postulates we presented. So in this case, if C is monotonic, idempotent, and satisfies local inclusion and locality, then any operator that satisfies these postulates is necessarily a sensitive contraction. Okay, and then we start to look at how we can apply this to study a belief change in non-classical logics, and we take Hormonal Logic, because Hormonal Logic is interesting since it's a restricted reasoning logic. So we can understand it as imposing some hyperintensional differences in classical propositional logic, and we construct a hyperintensional consequence operator on classical propositional logic that mimics the reasoning on Hormonal Logics. And we show that the C-sensitive contraction obtained using this hyperintensional consequence actually coincides with the notion of belief set Horn contraction previously defined by De Grande. When we look at the sets of closed Horn formulas. So the notion of minimality, we arrive based on C-sensitive contractions is actually a good notion of minimality considering this logic. So it's a promising result. But this is not a silver bullet. It does not work for any logic. In fact, if we take, for example, a very simple example of intuitionistic propositional logic, in intuitionistic propositional logic, the double negation does not hold, so we cannot conclude phi from not phi. So if we consider an agent with a belief set that's the closure of not P, obviously the agent does not believe P, but if we try to contract P from the sets for any of the operations we defined in this work, it will remove not P from the agent's belief set, because we are basically doing reasoning on the foundational logic and then applying hyperintensional reasoning to some extent. And there are partial solutions to this. We can make more flexible definitions and allow the construction of operations that would maintain this not P in the belief set of the agent. But usually since we are using the foundational logic as a base to define the notion of minimality, the notion of minimality on the foundational logic always acts as a upper boundary of what we can remove and what we can't remove. So it's difficult to exclude possibilities in which this kind of things will happen, because in the worst case, you do reasoning on the foundational logic. And so some final remarks. We can encode different notions of minimalities through the relationship between the two consequence operators, and depending on the properties of this consequence operators, these notions can coincide or can be different. We can understand several different non-classical logics as establishing hyperintensional differences in classical logic, and use classical belief change to approximate changes in these logics. And which notion of minimality is more suitable to a particular logic depends really on the relationship between C and Cn. So it's kind of experimental on how we define, how we use these things to define a belief change for a non-classical logic. And there seems to be a good connection to other notions in the literatures, such as local change and approximate belief change. So I'd like to thank the audience, and I'll be in the poster session for to reply to more technical questions. Thank you.